How would you react if you found out that your father was involved in the regime that carried out many of humanity's most cruel acts? Or even worse, that he was a key figure in its operation? Fortunately, for most of us, that question is simply a hypothetical exercise. But some people had to face that situation and deal with it every day of their lives. Marked by a legacy impossible to erase, the ways to react to such a discovery span the entire spectrum of human emotions. Today, in this new episode of Military History, we'll tell you all about the children of the Third Reich's leaders and how those crimes affected their lives. If you were to have a Nazi father, one of the most understandable reactions you could have is to want to sever any kind of connection with him. This is the case of Ricardo Eichmann, the youngest son of Adolf Eichmann. The latter was an SS officer and one of the main organizers of the Holocaust, which resulted in the deaths of approximately 7 million people. He was known as the architect of the Holocaust, responsible for the deportation of hundreds of thousands of Jews to concentration camps. He oversaw the transportation of Jews from Hungary, and by the time the transport ceased, over 400,000 Hungarian Jews had been forcibly deported. Their primary destination was the Auschwitz complex, where the vast majority were murdered. Understandably, Ricardo Eichmann wanted no relationship with his father. He did not grant interviews to journalists and distanced himself from any responsibility for his father's crimes, though he never denied them. In stark contrast, Adolf Eichmann's two older sons, Horst and Klaus, defended their father until his death and even followed in his footsteps. Eichmann, who had fled to Argentina after the end of the war, was captured by Mossad agents and taken to Israel for trial. His older sons attempted through various means to secure his return, even founding the Argentine National Socialist Front for this purpose. After Eichmann's famous conviction and execution in 1962, this party set aside its political facade and engaged in anti-communist criminal activities. It ended up being absorbed by the infamous Taquara nationalist movement, a neo-Nazi group that carried out terrorist acts on Argentine soil. In this way, Eichmann's older sons always argued for their father's innocence. Any crime committed, they said, was a consequence of obedience to a superior. We will see that this is not the only case where this occurs. Below, you can see a small part of the trial that led the architect of the Holocaust to his death sentence.
Als ich das erste Mal tote Menschen, tote Juden gesehen habe, war ich erschüttert gewesen. Und diese Reaktion auf meine Nerven hat seit der Zeit kein Ende mehr gefunden. Es wirkte weiter. Ich habe meine Arbeit nach dem eisernen Muss getan, das mir auferlegt worden ist. Ich bin beeindruckt durch dieses Geschehen, das ich sehen musste, verhalten gewesen, meinem Chef mehrmals zu bitten, er möge mich endlich um Gottes Willen davon entbinden.
As you can imagine, there were other similar cases of children defending the abominable actions of their parents. Hermann Göring, one of the key players of Nazism, was the leader of the Luftwaffe almost from its birth until the end of the regime, as well as the creator of the Gestapo, the official secret police of the National Socialist Party. With this force, and together with the SS, he planned and carried out the political purge known as the Night of the Long Knives, where almost 100 members of the Nazi Party opposed to Hitler's leadership were murdered. Thousands more were arrested, with the excuse of preventing an alleged internal coup d'etat. As if that were not enough, Göring was also involved in the deportation of people to concentration camps, mainly Soviet prisoners of war. All this did not stop his daughter Edda from defending him throughout her life. Goddaughter of Adolf Hitler himself, Edda always maintained the idea that her father was innocent. According to her, the problem had been his unconditional loyalty to the Führer. These were her words. Göring had sworn personal loyalty to her and would never abandon her, even when Hitler had gone too far. The things that happened to the Jews were horrible, but quite separate from my father. Despite her words, Edda attended funerals of former leaders of the Third Reich and political events sponsored by neo-Nazi parties. She also wanted to keep the priceless works of art looted or illegally obtained by Göring during the war, but unanimously the German government rejected her request. You can hear her warmly remembering her father.
Mein Vater liebte es, jedem Einzelnen einen Gabentisch herzurichten. Er hatte sich ganze Listen dafür zusammengestellt, die zum Teil heute noch existieren. Unsere Angestellten feierten, wie gesagt, mit uns, da die Eltern sie als ihre Freunde betrachteten. Dafür haben sie uns auch eine rührende Treue bewiesen, obwohl sie zum Teil wegen ihrer Zugehörigkeit zum Hause Göring nach Kriegsende viel durchzumachen hatten. Ich bin heute noch mit einigen von ihnen in Verbindung und sie sprechen nach wie vor mit großer Zuneigung und Verehrung von meinen Eltern.
Other relatives of the Luftwaffe leader did not follow his daughter's example. Bettina and Peter Göring, his great-nephews, decided to make a drastic decision. At the age of 30, they underwent surgery to become sterile. Thus, according to them, no one else would carry on the dark legacy of the Görings. Both acknowledged the crimes of their great-uncle and dedicated their lives to raising awareness about the Holocaust. Now let's see what happened with the daughter of Heinrich Himmler, who did not have a very different reaction from Etta Göring's. Remember that Himmler was the head of the armed branch of the SS and one of the main architects of the Holocaust. He formed the death squads, responsible for the mass murder of millions of people, and administered numerous concentration camps. Captured by the Allies shortly after the end of the war in Europe, he preferred to commit suicide rather than face trial. After Hitler, Himmler is often remembered as one of the most ruthless members of Nazism. His daughter was Gudrun Himmler, better known by the nickname Puppy. Like Eichmann's elder children, Gudrun was openly neo-Nazi, joining an underground organization that helped former SS members escape justice. She even donated money for the defense of some war criminals, such as Klaus Barbie, a senior SS officer known as the Butcher of Lyon. Remember this name, because we will talk about him again later. Puppy worked for the West German intelligence service until the 1960s, when she was dismissed along with other Nazi party members. Until her last breath, Gudrun denied the Holocaust and absolved her father of any crime he had been accused of. It is clear that, as the saying goes, the apple does not fall far from the tree. Let's move on to the case of another of Adolf Hitler's godchildren, the eldest son of Martin Bormann. Bormann was one of the most powerful figures within the Nazi Party, serving as head of the party chancellery and personal secretary to the Führer. In fact, after the dictator's suicide, he succeeded him as the party's top authority for a few days. This allows us to assert, with absolute certainty, that he was the second most important Nazi after Hitler himself. For many other German leaders, the secretary was an incredibly dangerous person, as he wielded great influence over the Führer. He was a fervent anti-Semite and advocated for the persecution, mistreatment, and death of Catholics, Jews, and Slavs within the areas conquered by Germany. Bormann committed suicide on May 2, 1945, when the Soviets had already reached Berlin, although his body was found years later. Until it was confirmed that the remains belonged to him, one of the most speculated hypotheses was that Bormann had escaped and was hiding in Argentina, like many of his compatriots. Let's see an interview from the year 1972 with one of the individuals tasked with finding the Nazi who was convinced of this theory.
Según mi entendimiento, que Martin Bormann pasó por la República después de la Segunda Guerra Mundial en 1948 es seguro y es indiscutible. No puedo opinar si vive todavía o pasó o vivió recientemente en la República Argentina, eso no puedo contestar.
Everything seemed to indicate that his son, Martin Adolf Bormann, would follow in his father's footsteps within the party. Referred to by several Nazi leaders as Kronprinz, which means Crown Prince, he was sent as a young boy to a Nazi boarding school in Bavaria, an institution where future party leaders were sought to be molded. It was a strict place. At 13, he was already forced to undergo military training, to read and study Mein Kampf, the famous book written by the Führer, and to learn the doctrine of the Nazi Party until it was ingrained in his mind. After Hitler's death, with his parents missing, he had to fend for himself until he could take refuge on a farm. There, he began to learn about the crimes of the party to which he belonged. A few years later, he turned fully to religion, Perhaps seeking to rid himself of the guilt he felt, he became a priest, going as a missionary to war-torn areas of Africa. For almost his entire adult life, he dedicated himself to spreading awareness and informing the population about the crimes committed by the Nazis, including those of his father. However, according to him, he could never stop loving his progenitor, even going so far as to say the following: "I do not hate him. For many years, I learned to differentiate between my father as an individual and my father as a Nazi politician and officer." Now let's see what happened with the descendants of Albert Speer, a German architect who served as Minister of Armaments and War Production during World War II. For many years, Speer was considered something of a good Nazi, meaning a normal man surrounded by monsters, overwhelmed by circumstances, and forced to act against his true nature. He stated that despite being aware of the crimes committed by other members of the Third Reich, he did not know the extent of the atrocities, particularly regarding the Holocaust. During the Nuremberg trials, he was sentenced to 20 years in prison for his role in the war. Recently, Speer's version began to be controversial, as evidence emerged that he was fully aware of the forced labor to which prisoners and civilians were subjected during the war. His own son, Albert Speer Jr., supported this revision, as he recognized his father's crimes from a young age and distanced himself from his legacy. Along with Martin Adolf Bormann and the youngest son of Adolf Eichmann, he created an organization to help victims of Nazism. Very different from the examples we have seen so far is the case of the son of Hans Frank. Known as the Butcher of Poland, Hans Frank was the Governor-General of the occupied territories of this country, from its invasion by Germany until the collapse of his government in early 1945. During his tenure, the Polish population was constantly terrorized by his methods. These involved segregating Jews from the region and forcing them to perform forced labor, killing anyone who dared to resist. Additionally, he oversaw the Warsaw Ghetto and 4 concentration camps. During his time in power, 4 million people were murdered under his jurisdiction. After the war, he was found guilty in the Nuremberg trials and sentenced to death. Based on the examples we've seen so far, we might think that Hans Frank's son would feel some sort of sympathy for his father, regardless of how ruthless his actions were. But this is not the case. Ever since the magnitude of his father's crimes became known, Nicholas Frank has denounced his father on every possible occasion, writing books about it and participating in documentaries. He once said that he carried a photo of his father dead on the gallows in his wallet for many years. On one occasion, when asked about his father, he said the following: "I no longer hate him, I just despise him." You can see him below talking about him.
And here's the King of Poland, my father, on the tower of the Wawel Castle. And this I hate especially, this picture.
Why?
Yes, because this direction was the ghetto, this direction was concentration camp, down in the streets, everywhere, the SS guards, and he was pretending here to be a peaceful, far-looking statesman. He knew exactly what he really was, the governor on a sea of blood.
Before we move on to our last example, we should mention something. All the cases we saw so far showed us how these sons and daughters of Nazis dealt with the heavy legacy of their parents during their lives after the war, but some did not have that opportunity. Joseph Goebbels, one of the most infamous leaders of the Third Reich, does not need much of an introduction. He was Minister of Propaganda, a close collaborator of Hitler, and a violent anti-Semite. He managed the information coming out of Germany, manipulating the truth to favor the interests of the party, and even encouraged Hitler to adopt increasingly extreme measures against the population they considered inferior. In 1945, Goebbels, his wife Magda, and his 6 children were in Hitler's underground bunker when the Red Army arrived in Berlin. Seeing that defeat was inevitable, Goebbels and his wife decided to commit suicide and take their children to the grave. First, they injected them with morphine to make them unconscious, and then they crushed a cyanide vial in each of their mouths. According to some witnesses, the Goebbels did not want their children to grow up hearing that their father had been one of the greatest criminals of the century. Below we can see a historian talking about this dark moment.
Goebbels, I would argue, did something that people who are in psychotic depression do when they commit suicide. They have a tendency to take their wives and children with them, because in their minds the future is so horribly black. There's no hope in the future. Such horrible punishment is coming that I'm going to save my children the agony that they're going to be put through because they're my children.
The couple claimed that, had they been old enough, the children would have supported the decision. At the time of their deaths, they were 12, 11, 9, 8, 6, and 4 years old. As you can see, for some, the actions and crimes of their parents weighed heavily on their conscience. For others, they cost them their lives. The last case we're going to talk about is that of Sword Chalandon. Chalandon is a famous writer and journalist born in Tunisia who covered numerous events in the Middle East. He also investigated and was present at the trial of the aforementioned Klaus Barbie, the Butcher of Lyon, a Nazi officer responsible for torturing French prisoners of the Gestapo in that city. Chalandon's father asked his son to include him as a spectator in the trial. The elderly man had always claimed to be a member of the French resistance, so his son assumed he wanted the satisfaction of seeing one of the Nazis responsible for so much suffering being judged. But during the trial, his father had curious attitudes. He seemed to smile when Barbie spoke and looked upset when the resistance members did. Until his adolescence, Chalandon had complete trust in his father. He had never questioned his words, not even when he claimed to have been the head of French intelligence, or when he narrated a supposed romantic disagreement with the famous French singer Edith Piaf. After Barbie's trial,
Después del juicio
Chalandon
de
and his
Barbie,
father didn't speak
Chalandon y
about
su
the war
padre
until
no
the year
volvieron
the
a
old
hablar
man
de la
died.
guerra hasta el
On
año
his
en que el
deathbed,
anciano
he
murió.
confessed the truth. He had never been a French partisan. In fact, he had been a member of the SS, fought on the Soviet front, and even was one of the last defenders of Hitler's bunker in Berlin. The truth Chalandon believed he knew collapsed in the blink of an eye. But this is not the end of the story. In 2020, his brother sent him a dossier from a French prison that showed that when the war in Europe ended, their father had been imprisoned there, so it was impossible for him to have been in Berlin defending the Führer's bunker. Even on the verge of death, he chose to keep lying. Chalandon wasted no time in uncovering more truths about his father. He had enlisted in the French army, but when he saw they were close to defeat, he deserted. He then joined the Tricolor Legion of Vichy's collaborating France, but deserted again when its members were sent to fight on the Soviet front. Captured by the German army, he was recruited into the Motorized Corps, a Nazi paramilitary organization responsible for transporting troops to the front. To the surprise of few, he deserted again and surrendered to the French resistance. He stayed with them until, while in Belgium, he abandoned them to find the Germans. Unfortunately for him, he was captured by American troops, who didn't believe his words and sent him to the French army, which imprisoned him for a year. He met Chalandon's
Conoció a
mother
la
in
madre de
Tunisia,
Chalandon
to
en
whom he
Túnez,
claimed he was
a
a
quien le
secret
dijo
agent.
que era un agente
As the
secreto.
journalist says,
Según dice
I
el
don't judge the
periodista,
young man who got
yo no
lost during
juzgo al
the war,
joven que se
but the
perdió
lying
durante
father
la
who lied to
guerra,
me and my
sino
family
al
and
padre
destroyed us.
mentiroso que me
Not the
mintió a mí y a
collaborator,
mi
but the bastard
familia y
who
nos
left us without
destruyó.
memory, without
No al
anything.
colaboracionista,
You can see him
sino al
talking about his
bastardo
father.
que nos dejó sin memoria, sin nada. Lo puedes ver hablando sobre su padre.
Et mon grand-père m'avait dit un jour, il faut que tu saches plusieurs choses. D'abord, ton père, il avait choisi le mauvais camp pendant la guerre, le mauvais camp. La deuxième chose, c'est qu'il avait vu, nous sommes de Lyon, il avait vu habillé en allemand à Lyon. Et la troisième chose, il me dit, tu vois, un jour, il était extrêmement énervé, il me dit, n'importe comment, il faut que tu le saches. Tu es un enfant de salaud.
So you can see that the reactions of these sons and daughters are tremendously varied. The feelings of those who couldn't separate their affection for their parents from their appalling actions during the Third Reich are understandable, although not justifiable because of it. However, the weight of the evidence left by history tends to undermine even the most stubborn denial. If not for them, at least for us. We've reached the end of the video and we want to ask you, if your father had been a Nazi, do you think you could have forgiven him? Leave your answer in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to learn about many more military events that left their mark on history.